Ivy Rivera. I'm a psychic medium, a Taino Airwalk, and I own a school called the Ivy League Psychic Academy. What you guys are catching tonight is a free mini class. I've been putting on 1 to 2 per week since the pandemic hit. And tonight we are talking about the War on Intuition Part 2. Government, schools, and family systems. How they feed the war on intuition. If you missed Part 1, you're going to do the same thing. Go to YouTube at Ask Ivy and go up in the playlist for classes. You can listen to all of those there or anywhere you receive a podcast. The War on Intuition Part 1 covered psychology and religion. We cannot separate these 3 areas: government, schools, and family systems. We have to understand that all 3 feed each other and the war on intuition. So the educational systems, especially here in America, are backed by government funding. They're perpetuated by social and family dynamics. I really didn't want to turn this into a history lesson. I didn't want to lose your attention. There are some historical facts included in this today. Obviously, there would have to be. But I really wanted to keep sight on what we're talking about here today. And that is this. We are going through an awakening right now. 2019, 2020, 2021. This is going to continue. I see this increasing all the way up to 2024. We are seeing an awakening where people are no longer willing to subjugate their power, their connection to spirit and their higher minds and God, to a church, to a religion, to a toxic system that feeds, for example, here in America, right, Christianity being the biggest thing, the churches, that religion being the biggest thing, that feeds division, that keeps people from being their authentic selves, whether it's because they're gay, they're LGBTQ, or they're native, maybe they're black, and part of their historical roots and their belief system was very different than the church. They don't want people to think for themselves. They are based on cult mentality, which is fear of hell, fear of ostracization, fear of loneliness, punishment. That's really the definition of a cult. Okay, when you hold people, you accumulate people based on that fear and toxicity. When we look at where we are now and where we came from, and we see that we are believing something different than what our parents taught us, okay, than even what our grandparents may have taught us, we want to experience something more. We see that the church is fraudulent, that the church is the root of so much sexual abuse and rape. Okay, that the church is the root of us finding all of the indigenous children, their little unmarked graves, their bodies turning up by the thousands from these Indian residential schools. When we see this, so many of us have reached a breaking point. We're like, we are done. We are done with the old toxic belief system, and we do not plan to carry it on to the next generation. The buck stops here. So where does that really leave us? So many of us want to know more about our ancestors and our roots, and then what is spirit and how does the universe work? What does it mean? Well, we see about 67% of the younger generations tapping in to mediumship and astrology. And I love that. They have abandoned their parents' religion and what they were raised on. That's because the truth is revealed in mediumship. The truth is revealed in astrology as well as numerology. So today I just want to focus on a few of the different things that go on in each of these areas. I want to help you open up your eyes to what has happened to you, how you've been programmed, how you can deprogram, and how you may be feeding the problem. Okay, we need to put an end to this abuse. We also don't spend enough time, for those of us that are looking to engage more in spiritual development, we don't spend enough time looking at these key areas and how they create blocks. A lot of people are very frustrated. They're trying to intuitively develop and they can't understand why. Check these categories and check the War on Intuition Part 1, where I talked about psychology, okay, and doctors and misdiagnoses, and religion and how it's also coming from there. What are some of the things that the government is doing that you may be overlooking, okay, that is crippling our intuitive and spiritual growth. Well, one of them is the basic gay rights, LGBTQ rights, and things like this. When we look at most Native communities, including in I'm Taino Arawak, we really honored two-feathered people as special intuitives because they are so well balanced with the feminine and masculine energies. And so I find that a lot of restriction on the LGBTQ community is inadvertently, it may not look that way, but I believe it is part of it, keeping that power away from the two-feather people. People who are able to naturally tap into both masculine and feminine energies have more of a connection to divine wisdom in the universe. They automatically have an increased intuitive intelligence in all areas, psychic, mediumistic, empathic. I talk about this here and with my students all the time, how the LGBTQ community are going to be the leaders in the spiritual revolution that has begun in 2019. Let's also look at what the government has done through the slavery system. When we had the slaves come from Africa, they were, of course, taught brutally, beaten or murdered for practicing their religions. That was not an option. They were also told they couldn't go to church. They weren't embraced in the Christian community, but many masters brought pastors from their church and would send them to the plantations to preach services, to the slaves. And the Black community didn't care for it. It wasn't part of their roots. Their roots involved polytheistic belief system. Many of them did believe in one supreme God, but they believed in storytelling and dancing and spirit possession. What they preferred to do was to combine syncretism. Okay, I had never heard that word, but that's apparently what it was. The combination for what slaves did, taking Christianity and their old beliefs from Africa, syncretism. So they put them together and they sort of made their own pastors. So they were not allowed to do this. If they got caught, again, it would be a brutal situation. But they did, to hold on to their faith. And we could see that a lot, even in like the Baptist church today, dancing and singing and being overtaken by spirit and things like this. But the old toxic roots of Christianity are still very much there. And that leads to so much oppression of the divine feminine, feeds the patriarchy, and is against feminism, is also still against anything involving Christianity, is against the individual going inward to connect with God, going inward to receive messages directly from spirit, a higher power. And when there is healing that needs to be done, they're also not encouraged to do that for themselves. They're encouraged to go to the priests, to go to the nuns, to go to the higher ups. Everything has to be subjugated. We see that the stories, the singing, the dancing, the belief systems from Africa, and we also have to keep in mind that like 10% of slaves were Muslim as well. Okay, so all of this was wiped out or had to be hidden from them. We see that now that this awakening is going on more so than ever, people are wanting to get back into their roots. Okay, so this is really exciting to watch, especially among our African-American and Black brothers and sisters, that they are getting back into where they came from. And that's a beautiful thing. I believe that the families, the people that suffered the most and carried on the most, okay, so we have to take responsibility and hold ourselves accountable. But those social and family systems that carried on the most were those that had to adapt and convert to Christianity or the government system because their lives depended on it. So we're looking at a huge uprise in the Black community as well as the Native communities. I don't have time to focus on everything here today, but I did want to talk also about how the Native American communities, the indigenous people, were brutalized under the government systems, which then perpetuated it in the school systems, which then trickles down into social and family systems, of course. But we see that the government banned, when they saw how powerful the natives were and how spiritual, how connected to God, how right they were living, the goal was to strip us of everything that we knew. And so we weren't allowed to practice our native language, ceremonies, dances, music. Then, of course, we were here in America, abandoned essentially on reservations to fend for ourselves. And then came the Indian residential schools. The Indian residential schools, where we are now uncovering the bodies, these unmarked graves of these children who were brutally murdered there. We are now seeing how severe the conditions were and beginning a healing process of correcting that. But we need to remember that we can't just blame the government for the Indian residential schools. These were ran by churches almost all of the time. These were priests. These were nuns that carried out the rape, the brutal physical abuse, the verbal abuse. We saw that these children were dying and their fellow students would know it, and the moms and the dads were not called home for their deaths. Rape, sodomy was a typical punishment. This is what the priests, this is what the nuns were doing. I heard one story of a gentleman recently. He was talking about what he had experienced when he was there. So this isn't like hundreds of years ago. These people are still here talking about it right now. Okay? This is now. So we can't blame it on the past, put it to the past. And he would talk about the food and how the food that was given to the priests and the nuns was amazing. It was fresh. It was delicious. It would smell so good. But the food that was given to the native children, the students, was rotten. They would often vomit and then be forced through punishment to eat their own vomit. He talked, and this broke my heart, about one incident where they had pork. They had gotten pigs shipped there. And the nuns and the priests, okay, religious people, Christian people, were sitting at the tables next to them, eating the bacon and the ham and the eggs. And on the plates of these native children was rotten pieces of meat with hair still on it, and they were vomiting into their food. This was done regularly to break them down. Okay? The government, the church, they don't want to see that these children have any esteem whatsoever, that they could ever replace what they lost through their culture, that they would ever reconnect to God, to spirit, because all they knew was this hell on earth that these religious people were creating for them. And that has generational repercussions, without a doubt. So we're looking now still, and this goes also for the Black community, descendants of slaves. We have long-standing intergenerational trauma, cycles of violence and abuse, premature deaths, mental disorders, substance abuse. We could go on and on and on. So this is happening still now. So far, unmarked graves of the murdered children, we found over 1,308. I think that's accurate in Canada, but there's at least, they believe, 4,100 remaining that they haven't uncovered. Now here in America, we are starting the journey of finding these unmarked graves through our schools. We have Deborah Holland, our first Native American Secretary of Interior, announced the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. And so now we're expected to find at least 40,000 unmarked graves of these children here in America. If you're Puerto Rican, you were Taino Arawak, that would have also been part of this system. Until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act passed, Natives were not allowed to practice any of their rituals, ceremonies, belief systems, language, nothing publicly. Okay, that was 1970. I was born in 1979. I mean, this is like a minute ago. We have to understand how significant this influence still is today. And we need to have a critical eye toward the government, the schools, the educational system, our social constructs, and our family dynamics, and how they continue to keep this toxic system perpetuating. Right, so I want to talk about the schools, okay? Let's talk a little bit more about the schools. From the minute a child enters into school, this was horrible for me. This is horrible for a lot of kids, especially if you're mediumistic, you're psychic, you're empathic. You're told immediately that talking to your imaginary friend or talking with the spirits you've been talking about is shameful, that it's psychotic, that you're going to get locked up in the mental institution, that you're doing something bad, that you should hide it, that you should deny it. It is an immediate reaction to school that they are never to talk about anything spiritual, anything intuitive, or even worse than all those other things happening, they'll be socially ostracized because the other kids will think it's weird and bad. Okay, that it makes you bad. So what does this lead to? Okay, immediately at about 5 years old or upon entering school, you're shamed. You have to detach from your intuition and spirit, who's been there for you all along, and you develop blocks to that interaction because we naturally want to survive. These blocks lead to ADD, mental disturbances, depression, anxiety, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic migraines, hyperactivity. All the things we see happening with kids is because they're not allowed to be in the flow of their natural rhythm. And then, of course, as adults, we see onset ADHD, irritable, but all those other things. Onset bipolar disorder later in life. This was just on the news recently. There was an interview with a 6th grader and her mother. They are Indigenous. This was in Canada, but this is no different than anything that happens here in the States. They were forced to fill out a form as homework that said 5 wonderful things that the Indian residential schools did for the natives. And they wanted them not only to fill it out, they wanted them to find 3 sites online to back it. Now, with information like this all over the place, saying that they were good, how would a child learning ever know the truth? They educated them saying sometimes the schools messed up, but the worst thing they ever did to the kids was to cut their long hair. And so this native child was forced to do this homework assignment and obviously was distraught. It ended up on the news. But this is the equivalent, this disgusting misrepresentation and these lies, this fraud, is the equivalent of us keeping critical race theory out of the school system. So we're trying to do the same thing with other groups of people that need to be represented. Okay, that they act like the government and the church and the right wing. Critical race theory is like Satan. It's like Satan coming to take away. To take away what? To take away what exactly? To take away the truth. So the closer and closer we get to examining things like critical race theory, the truth behind the foundation of this country and how it's based on colonization and murder and capitalism and the patriarchy and all of this, the closer and closer we get to these things, the closer we get to coming back in touch with our intuitive intelligence and spirit. And that's where the real revolution happens. How does this trickle down into family systems and social systems? Sadly, even if you don't want to admit it, even if your parents don't want to admit it or your grandparents don't want to admit it, they were part of this destruction. And the families that hold to it the most are the ones who were threatened with survival. And that is, I think, the saddest story of all, that we could have come from tribal roots, from a deep spiritual system that worked like a science. It was healing. It was energizing. It helped us to understand how to live in harmony with the earth, with the environment, with others. And they were destroyed and forced to believe in the Christian system of thinking, or they were murdered. Okay. And so now today, when they have an opportunity, when your parents, when your grandparents have an opportunity to get back in touch with their roots, to become more spiritual, to tap into their intuition, they will tell you it's demonic. They will tell you that it's bad. They will dig in for the long haul. Christianity is the way to go. It is a cult, people. It is a cult. It is based on nothing but fear. But if your grandparents, if your parents, if your family, okay, if your friends won't abandon that once and for all and go back to where they came from, this is why we call church roots revival. Roots revival. Okay? If we can't do this, then we are fulfilling what this destruction meant to do. And it's all about money, and it's all about power. And we can lead, but only through example. We cannot change anyone else. We can't take everybody with us. It is a long, dirty journey. It is often lonely. You may be the only one until you meet members of your soul tribe, until you start to really find the like-minded that you can connect with, until you really understand how spirit works in your life, how the universe is supporting you in this change, how the environment, Mother Earth, embraces you in this change, how we bring healing to our ancestors and break the chains through this change. Until we do that, we can feel as though we're alone, and it can be scary to start on this journey. It can be scary to stop going to church or identifying with it. Your family is going to try to suck you back in. Your friends, your entire social environment will tell you that you're demonic, that you're feeding dark energy, that you've lost your way, when you're actually taking the first steps in finding the true path, okay, that you've always belonged on. So I think that it's important for you to understand that being ostracized or being shunned is not the worst thing that could happen to you. Staying in a stagnant, toxic, lying cesspool of relationships is the worst thing that could happen to you. It's also the worst thing that can happen to your faith. And one of the things that families do, social systems do, our schools, our governments do, is they feed this concept of marriage, that you must get married, you must procreate, you must lock yourself into that system. And ultimately, it's feeding the head count on the cult. Because once you are in that deep, it gets even tougher to get back out. So don't buy into any of that. It's an enslavement. It's an entrapment system. Do we have questions? Danielle Johnson. Hi, Danny. She said, hi, Ivy and Paul. This is Danny. Ivy incredibly described how slaves had to conform to Christianity, and you uplifting the brutality against indigenous siblings is powerful. Speak the truth, sister. Yes. Thank you, Danny. And women in particular. What is this fear? What is this fear? We're looking at this now in Afghanistan. I just put out a TikTok yesterday, and it went up on my YouTube as a short also, where there was an interview, and I forget her name. I'm just learning about her now. But she was a spokeswoman for women's rights in Afghanistan. And she said they don't fear the B-52. The Taliban doesn't fear any military. They fear the woman. And what is happening with this awakening? Okay, it is the natives, it is the blacks, it is the minorities, it is the women, and it is the LGBTQ community leading this revolution back to the awakening. And it's going to shatter all of these systems. So in particular, the brutality against the women during the time of slavery and still now. We have to look at toxic masculinity. Just because we're the same color doesn't mean we don't do it to each other. We have to look at the patriarchy and the toxic masculinity that is being brought to the forefront today and say, how are you feeding it? How is this feeding it? It is hatred against the women, because the women are the most connected with the divine feminine creatures on earth to the spiritual. Absolutely. Thank you, Danny. How to tap into your intuition. I mean, that's part of the reason, like I said in the beginning of the class, that's part of the reason I wanted to hold this, because I see a lot of people struggling. And I noticed that you're not looking at how your therapist may be feeding the problem. If your therapist is telling you that you're psychotic instead of intuitive, we've got an issue. If the church is telling you that you tapping into your intuition is demonic instead of spiritual, we've got an issue. Okay, you have to look at all of these systems a little deeper probably than what you have been. But I think that the easiest way is to be honest about where you are in your spiritual development and where you would like to be, and be honest about where you are with your intuitive intelligence, that's psychic, mediumistic, and empathic, and where you would like to see it go, where you would ultimately like to be. And I would recommend that you sit with your ancestors and your guides, and you do this for maybe 10 minutes a day with your morning coffee, before you talk to anyone, before you get on social media. Put on some music that doesn't have words, something rhythmic that can take you on that journey, and sit with them and ask them what you can work on that day, or what they want to tell you for that day. It's like eating an elephant, one bite at a time. You do not want to try to take this as one big lump sum, okay? And piece by piece, it will become more clear. They will show you happily. They are so rejoicing every time you pick up on one of the signs and symbols they're trying to give you, okay? And every time you develop, it's like a big party up there, okay? Celebrating on your behalf, because again, it does heal also through the ancestral line and future generations. And so the support could not be more overwhelming. It's you engaging with it on a regular basis in a somewhat structured way that really matters. I would also recommend plug, right, my psychic mediumship course, because that trains you in the entire lost language: psychic, mediumistic, empathic, all the different ways different spirits communicate. So invest, definitely. Okay. Next week's class is suicide and depression. Okay, so I think it's interesting that Spirit had me line them up that way, because one of the things I wanted to talk about tonight, but I felt like I should pull back, is suicide and depression, and how living within this toxic system so often leads to that. Suicide, depression, possession. Okay, we can't stay here. We don't belong here living in these systems. And we'll talk about a lot of other aspects of intuitive intelligence and spirituality, and how we should be mindful about suicide and depression, how we can counteract it with being more productive with our intuition, because it is overwhelming. No doubt about it. I will admit that at all times, but there are solutions to getting healthy. All right, you guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Spirit.